Hi guys, I wanted to jump on and get you guys chapter 9 of the Chronicles of Narnia, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Here we go. In the witch's house. And now, of course, you want to know what had happened to Edmund. He hadn't eaten his share of the dinner, but he hadn't really enjoyed it because he was thinking all the time about Turkish delight. And there's nothing that spoils the taste of good ordinary food half so much as the memory of bad magic food. And he had heard the conversation, and he hadn't enjoyed it much either, because he kept thinking that the others were taking no notice to him and trying to give him the cold shoulder. They weren't, but he had imagined it. And then he had listened until Mr. Beaver told them about Aslan, and until he had heard the whole arrangement for meeting Aslan at the stone table. It was then that he began to very quietly edge himself under the curtain which hung over the door, for the mention of Aslan gave him a mysterious and horrible feeling, just as it gave the others a mysterious and lovely feeling. Just as Mr. Beaver had been repeating the rhyme about Adam's flesh and Adam's bone, Edmund had been very quietly turning the door handle, and just before Mr. Beaver had begun telling them that the White Witch really wasn't human at all, but a half djinn and a half giantess, Edmund had gotten outside into the snow and cautiously closed the door behind him. You mustn't think that even now Edmund was quite so bad, but he wanted his brothers and sisters to be turned into stone. He did want Turkish delight and to be a prince and later a king, and to pay Peter out for calling him a beast. As for the witch would do with the others, he did not want her to be particularly nice to them, certainly not to be put out on the same level as him, but he managed to believe, or to pretend that he believed, that she wouldn't do anything very bad to them, because, he said to himself, all these people who say nasty things about her are her enemies, and probably half of it isn't true. So she was jolly nice to me anyways, and much nicer than they are. I expect that she is the rightful queen, really. Anyway, she'll be better than that awful Aslan. At least, that was the excuse that he made in his own mind for what he was doing. It wasn't a very good excuse, however, for deep down inside of him, he knew that the White Witch was bad and cruel. The first thing he realized when he got outside and found the snow falling all around him was that he had left his coat behind in the beaver's house. And of course, there was no chance of going back to get it now. The next thing he realized was the daylight was almost gone, for it had been nearly 3 o'clock when they sat down to dinner, and the winter days were short. And he hadn't reckoned on this, but he had to make the best of it. So he turned up his collar and shuffled across the top of the dam. Luckily, it wasn't so slippery since the snow had fallen to the far side of the river. It was pretty bad when he reached the far side. It was growing darker every minute, and that with that, the snowflakes twirling all around them, he could hardly see 3 feet ahead. And then, too, there was no road. He kept slipping into deep drifts of snow and skidding on frozen puddles and tripping over the fallen tree trunks, sliding down the steep banks and barking his shins against the rocks until he was wet and cold and bruised all over. The silence and the loneliness were dreadful. In fact, I really think he might have given up the whole plan and gone back and owned up and made friends with the others if he hadn't happened to say to himself, "When I'm king of Narnia, the first thing I shall do will be to make some decent roads." And of course, that set him off thinking about being a king and all the other things he would do, and this cheered him up a great deal. He had just settled in his mind what sort of palace he would like to have and how many cars and all of his private cinema and where the principal railways would run and what laws he would make against beavers and dams, and was putting the final touches to some schemes for keeping Peter in his place. When the weather changed. First the snow stopped. Then a wind sprang up and it became freezing cold. Finally, the clouds rolled away and the moon came out. It was a full moon shining on all that snow. It made everything almost as bright as day, only the shadows were rather confusing. He would have never have found his way if the moon hadn't come out. By the time that he had got to the other river, you remember he had seen when they had first arrived at the beavers, a smaller river flowing into the great one lower down. He now reached this and turned to follow it up, but the little valley down which it had came was much steeper and rockier than the one he had just left, and much overgrown with bushes, so that he could not have even managed it all in the dark. Even as it was, he got wet through, for he had to stoop up under branches and great loads of snow and came sliding off onto his back. And every time that this happened, he thought more and more how he hated Peter, and just as if all of this had been Peter's fault. But at last he came to a part where it was more level and the valley opened up. And there, on the other side of the river, quite close to him, in the middle of a little plain between the two hills, he saw what must have been the White Witch's house. And the moon was shining brighter than ever, and the house was really a small castle. It seemed to be all towers, little towers with long pointed spikes on them, sharp as needles, and they looked like a huge dunce's cap or sorcerer's caps. And they shone in the moonlight, and their long shadows looked strange on the snow. Edmund began to be afraid of the house. But it was too late to think of turning back now. He crossed the river on the ice and walked up to the house. There was nothing stirring, not even the slightest sound anywhere. Even his own feet made no noise on the deep, newly fallen snow. He walked on, past the corner after corner of the house, and past every turret after turret, to find the door. He had to go right around to the far side before he had found it. It was a huge arch, but the great iron gate stood wide open. Edmund crept up to the arch and looked inside into the courtyard, where he saw a sight that nearly made his heart stop beating. Just inside the gate, with the moonlight shining on it, stood an enormous lion, crouched as if it was ready to spring. And Edmund stood in the shadow of the arch, afraid to go on and afraid to go back, with his knees knocking together. He stood there so long that his teeth could have been shattering from the cold, even if they had not been shattering with fear. How long could this have really lasted? I don't know, but it seemed to Edmund to last for hours. Then, at last, he began to wonder why the lion was standing so still, for it hadn't even moved 1 inch since its first eye set on it. Edmund now ventured a little nearer, still keeping in the shadow of the arch as much as he could. He now saw, from the way that the lion was standing, that it couldn't have been looking at him at all, but supposedly turning its head, thought Edmund. In fact, it was staring at something else, namely a little dwarf who stood with his back to it, about 4 feet away. Aha, thought Edmund. When it springs at the dwarf, then that will be my chance to escape. But the lion never moved, nor did the dwarf. And now, at last, Edmund remembered what the others had said about the White Witch turning people into stone. Perhaps it was only a stone lion, and soon he had thought that he had noticed that the lion's back and the top of its head were covered with snow. Of course, it must be a statue. No living animal would have let itself get covered with snow. Then slowly, with his heart beating as it would burst, Edmund ventured to go up to the lion. Even now he had hardly dared to touch it, but at last he would put his hand very quickly, and he did. It was cold stone. He had been frightened more of the statue. The relief which Edmund had felt was so great that in spite of the cold, he suddenly got warm all over, right down to his toes. And at the same time, into his head what might have seemed a perfectly lovely idea. Probably, he thought, this is the great lion Aslan that they were all talking about. She caught him already and turned him into stone. And that's the end of all their fine ideas about him. Pooh! Who's afraid of Aslan? And he stood there gloating about the stone lion, and he did something very silly and childish. He took a stump of a lead pencil out of his pocket, and he scribbled a mustache on the lion's upper lip, and then a pair of spectacles on the lion's eyes. And then he said, "Yeah, silly old Aslan. How do you like being a stone? You thought of yourself mighty and fine, didn't you? But in spite of the scribbles on its face of the great stone, it still looked so terrible and sad, staring up into the moonlight, that Edmund didn't even really get any fun out of it. He turned away and began to cross the courtyard. As he got into the middle of it, he saw that there were dozens of statues all about, standing here and there, rather as the pieces stand on a chessboard and when it is halfway through with the game. There were stone statues and stone wolves and bears and foxes and catamounts of stone. There were lovely stone shapes that looked like women, but were really the great spirits of the trees. There was the great shape of a cantor and a winged horse and a long, lithe creature that Edmund took to be a dragon. They all looked so strange, standing there, perfectly lifelike and also perfectly still, in the bright, cold moonlight, that it was very eerie work crossing the courtyard. Right in the very middle stood a huge shape, like a man, but as tall as a tree, and with a fierce face and shaggy beard, and a great club in its right hand. Even though he knew that it was only a stone giant and not a live one, Edmund still did not like going past it. He now saw that there was a dim light showing from a doorway on the far side of the courtyard. He went to it. There was a flight of stone steps going up to an open door. Edmund went up them. Across the threshold lay a great wolf. It's all right, he kept saying to himself. It's only a stone wolf. It can't hurt me. He raised his leg to step over it. Instantly the huge creature rose. With all the hair bristling along its back, opened a great red mouth and a growling voice. Who's there? Who's there? Stand still, stranger, and tell me who you are. If you please, sir, said Edmund, trembling, so that he could hardly barely speak. My name is Edmund, and I'm the son of Adam that Her Majesty met in the wood the other day, and I've come to bring her the news that my brother and sisters are now in Narnia, quite close at the beaver's house. She wanted to see them. I will tell Her Majesty, said the wolf. Meanwhile, stand still on the threshold as you value your life. Then it vanished into the house. Edmund stood and waited, his fingers aching with cold and his heart pounding in his chest. The gray wolf, the chief of the witches' secret police, came bounding back and said, Come in, come in! Fortunate favor of the queen, or else not so fortunate. And Edmund went in, taking great care to not tread on the wolf's paws. He found himself in a long, gloomy hall with many pillars, full as the courtyard had been of many statues. The one nearest to the door was a little fawn with a very sad expression on his face, and Edmund couldn't help but wondering if this might be Lucy's friend. The only light came in from a single lamp, and close beside this sat the White Witch. Come in, your Majesty. I come, said Edmund, rushing eagerly forward. How dare you come alone, the White Witch said with a terrible voice. Did I not tell you to bring the others with you? Please, your Majesty, said Edmund. I've done the best I can. I brought them quite close. They're in the little house on top of the dam, just above the river, with Mr. and Mrs. Beaver. A slow, cruel smile came over the witch's face. Is this all your news? She asked. No, your Majesty, said Edmund, and proceeded to tell her all that he had heard before leaving the beaver's house. What? Aslan, cried the queen. Aslan, is this true? If I find that you have lied to me. Please, I'm only repeating what they said, stammered Edmund. But the queen, who was no longer attending to him, clapped her hands instantly, and some dwarf, whom Edmund had seen her with before, appeared. Make ready our sledge, ordered the witch, and use the harness without the bells. All right, guys, and that was chapter 9. Stay tuned to chapter 10.